Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Bacon Bits and Bites podcast. And I'm super excited today to talk with very special guest James Mulvany. James Mulvany is a successful entrepreneur and over the past 10 years has built multiple internet companies plus a property portfolio and has made a range of angel investments in startups. Having actually never had a job in his life, he started his first business when leaving school. James is the founder of Podcastco and Radio.co, two companies doing pioneering things in the online audio space. He's also the founder of matchmaker.fm, which is like Tinder, but for podcasters. Welcome to the show, James.
Thanks, Karen. How's it going?
Oh, it's going great. I am super excited because I am like a fangirl of Matchmaker, so I can't wait to talk about Matchmaker.fm plus your other companies. But first off, I'd like to talk about your entrepreneur journey because you started your first company when you're 16, and when most of us, were thinking about our part-time jobs, hanging out with our friends, and getting our driver's license, you were starting a company. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, so it all started because I was a little bit of a nerdy kid, I guess. I was probably quite shy. I was really interested in computers, I spent a lot of time like kind of locked away in my bedroom just learning how to build websites, and I kind of taught myself Photoshop. And it got to a period, we have something in the UK called study leave, right? So this is at the end of high school where you before you go into sort of sixth form college. So you're 16 years old and you get like 2 months off where you're supposed to revise and study for your exams. And I thought, well, this is great. I've got 2 months where I can do what I like. And of course, instead of studying, I thought, I'm going to see if I can make some money online. And at the time, this was like 2003. So it was kind of, the internet was still pretty young. It'd been around for 10 years, but I'd probably only been online for like 3 years myself. And, the concept of like having a startup or being an entrepreneur was something that I'd never really heard of. My dad always had, when I was growing up, he had a furniture business, very, very sort of different to obviously what I do now and what I've been doing for the last 15 years or so. But, I think that was probably one of the reasons I thought, I'm going to go and see if I can go out there and make some money, because he always said to me, going self-employed and starting his business was the best decision he ever made. And before that, when he was growing up, he did lots and lots and lots of different jobs and never really kind of found himself like a successful career until he kind of started out, his own business. So I guess that sort of taught me that, you don't need to go and work for someone. You don't need to go and find a job. I think on the other side, my mum really wanted me to go to college and then go to university. So I still ended up going down that route. I still went off to university and did an undergrad degree. But then by the time I'd sort of graduated from uni, I was in a really lucky position. I at that stage built a company which was, creating enough revenue so I didn't have to go and then find a full-time job or get a graduate role anywhere. And indeed, probably about a year after graduating, I was in a position where I made my first ever hire. So around 2010. So that's kind of how I got started, a very, very sort of brief overview. And I think really it just came from a desire to learn things. I was just a very curious kid. I wanted to absorb as much knowledge as I could, and I turned my hands to various different things. So I think I mentioned before, I taught myself Photoshop. So I think my first ever dollar online was selling like a logo design, or I used to make those little animated banners that used to flash away in the corner of websites. I had a business selling those and designing those for a while, and really it was just a case of like get out there, try and find some clients. And as soon as I think like the first ever, I got a PayPal account on my 16th birthday, because I think you had to be 16 to sign up to PayPal. And as soon as I got my first paycheck, which was only like $20 or something for designing a logo, I was like, wow, this is actually, this is a real thing. This is actually, something I can actually do. I can turn the skill like, on this screen in front of me and turn it into money, which then goes into my bank account. What a brilliant opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And when you received like that first $20 in your PayPal, like what was that feeling like? Did you go and blow it on something, or were you like, oh, I'm gonna reinvest it in my business?
I think I was just like, it was probably more like, wow, I've made $20. Now how can I make 100? And I think as well, it was for a 16-year-old kid, $20 is loads, right? It's a lot of money. So it's kind of more money than I'd be getting if I was going out and washing cars or doing a paper round or whatever. So a lot of my friends at that stage were looking at getting part-time jobs on a Saturday, and I was like, no, I think I'm going to focus on doing this. And it kind of just grew from there. Like I mentioned, I then went off to university, and I had a I did a year in industry. So we were supposed to go and work for someone else for a year, right, as part of my 4-year degree. So in the third year, you go and work for someone else. Well, I said to the university, I don't really want to go and find a job working for someone else. I really want to spend this year focusing on my business and seeing if I can kind of, I suppose, really test and make sure that I've got some legs. So when I actually graduate, I can kind of move it forward. And to begin with, the university were a bit like, we don't really have a structure for this. So they didn't, because normally, the employer would report on how well you're doing as part of that placement year. But of course, I was my own employer, so they kind of were like a bit funny about it to begin with. But eventually, they agreed to it, and I think by the end of that year, I was really certain that going down this route as an entrepreneur and going into the internet industry was something that I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's really fascinating. And after like your first company, you ended up starting a few other ones. Was there ever a point during that period of time where you ever thought like, oh, maybe I'll try a 9-to-5, or like, oh, I wonder what that'd be like, or you were just dead set, like, no, I'm gonna be an entrepreneur and build my own things?
I don't think there's ever been a point where I thought, no, I want to go and find a 9-to-5. I think there's certainly been times where I've probably thought, wow, having a 9-to-5 would be so much easier, because as an entrepreneur, you can sometimes. I've learned a lot more now to switch off. I used to be very much like, when I started out, I'd be in the office till 11 p.m. at night. Working crazy hours, and back then as well, going on vacation was really difficult because you didn't have. When I was at university, the iPhone was like launched whilst I was going through that process. So like when I was kind of like 18 to about 22, you didn't have smartphones, and it was very difficult. If I went on vacation, I didn't have any staff, so I just couldn't ever switch off, and I never really enjoyed. That's one regret I have. I never really went traveling or did anything like that because I was so focused on the business all the time. But I think. So yeah, to answer the question, I think there was probably times where I thought, wow, it would be easier if I had a full-time job, but I don't think I've ever really looked back, and I don't think I'd be unemployable now, I think, really.
So with respect to the two companies that I mentioned in the bio, Podcastco and Radio.co, what made you decide to focus on the online audio space?
Okay, so one of the things I was looking at before, kind of around the time I started my first business, I was really interested in the radio industry. I loved listening to the radio as a kid, and I DJ'd and stuff like this. So I was kind of thinking, wow, I could go and be a radio presenter. Maybe that would be a career that I could pursue. So I started getting work experience working in local radio stations and doing a bit of online radio and figuring out how to broadcast online. And as a result, I learned that process, and I think that was my first ever business. That was when I kind of went from, as I said before, like just doing odd jobs like designing websites for people or doing logos, to actually having a kind of a product to sell, which was my first ever business called Wave Streaming. I launched in 2004 when I was about 17, and we were selling streaming media services to the radio industry, and that was because I'd kind of gone into the industry, done a bit of work experience. Decided that I wasn't going to go follow that as a career, but I'd learned enough about it that I kind of understood the lingo, and I could see that there was an opportunity there. And again, there are other companies doing this, but I felt like their sales process, their marketing sites weren't really very sharp. It was very kind of clunky, old school like websites, and I thought, hey, I can design a better looking site than this. I think I can sell this product. Coincidentally, when I first started out, I didn't really know what I was doing, so I had to find someone else who was kind of clever enough to know about all the servers and stuff, and subsequently I picked a lot of that up. Well, then went off to university and sort of taught myself to code, and learned a lot more about the kind of the inner workings of how you build web products and how you maintain infrastructure, etc.
Okay, so there was Radio.co, and then at what point did you decide to start up Podcast.co? Because I can only imagine, running one business is tough, and then you decide to add another one, Podcastco, and then eventually matchmaker.fm, which we'll talk about a little bit later more in the episode. So I want to talk about your second company.
Yeah, so Radio.co was born out of the first business I ever had, Wave Streaming, and before that I had a couple of sort of failed ventures which I launched, which again, as an entrepreneur, that's part of the deal, right? You have some successes, you have some failures, and I've had both. And yeah, it kind of radio.co came around because we thought, let's build like a really nice platform. Learn a lot about the selling to the radio industry, so I thought, let's create sort of this nice unified platform. And I think the podcast.co came around because the industry, it's interesting with podcasting. Obviously, it's not a new medium. It's been around for like 15 years or so. However, probably around 2016, 17, it really had like a second wave. Like I think a lot of people started listening to podcasts that previously weren't. It sort of became a bit more of a mainstream medium. And so, we had a lot of clients who were approaching us saying, do you think you're going to build podcast functionality into radio.co? So we thought to ourselves, like, does it make sense to do that? Does it make sense to kind of make the product even more convoluted? Or should we launch this as a separate standalone platform and sort of just have a link between the two, which made more sense? And again, a lot of people who start podcasts don't want radio stations, but then a lot of radio stations do want podcasts. So there are two different markets there. But also, interestingly, probably a few years before that, like towards the end of when I was at uni, I remember actually I had a podcast for a period of time with my friend Steve, who was someone I was in a shared sort of like a shared office environment with, and we just would sit down and just discuss what we were doing. We were both like running startup companies. We kind of were really in the early stages of doing that, and we just used to sit down and discuss what we were doing, and it was quite fun. Interestingly, like all the episodes which we recorded have vanished off the internet, and I'd love to listen back to them, but I can't find them anywhere. They'll probably be on a hard drive somewhere. But yeah, again, back then I remember that the actual process of creating the podcast was so convoluted. It was really hard to get it out there online, and it was sort of something that I think was very much reserved for enthusiasts, because you had to download it onto your iPod, transfer it onto your iPod, and then you could take it out with you. But now, obviously, you just click a button and you can stream it if you're sat on the train or on the bus or wherever.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that it's such a lower barrier to entry now, would you say that's kind of one of the big factors that caused the second wave?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and also just the higher availability of people with mobile data, also smart speakers, things like that. It's just made the medium a lot more accessible. But also, that was one of the prime goals with podcast.co, and that's what we're trying to achieve with any product I build. I will always try and make it so it's simplifying a complex problem. I really enjoy creating technology or web products that are a simple solution to otherwise quite convoluted quite convoluted problems.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about having many successes and many failures, which is very common in an entrepreneur's journey. And rather than focusing on the successes, I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about the failures if you're open to it, because I love talking about it. Yeah. I feel people find other entrepreneurs, especially successful ones, like more relatable when they realize like, oh, okay, you struggled too. I'm like, oh, okay, I don't feel so bad anymore. Was there any like failure in particular that really stood out in your mind?
So I had there's a couple of businesses that I spent a lot of money on in terms of investing in time and hiring staff, and they just haven't worked out. The first was a platform called CDNify, which still exists. It got acquired in the end. Whether or not I made much money on that is very much questionable, because the price it was acquired for was probably maybe less than I'd spent on actually building the platform and everything. And we ran that for about 2 years, and it just didn't make sense. And I think really CDNify was a content delivery network. To sort of put it in a simple way, it's basically a platform which accelerates websites. So it'll host images or web pages on a network of servers all around the world. And we kind of saw an opportunity there were quite a few big companies in this space. So we thought, well, there's room for a startup, something that's kind of a bit more cool, and will work with for more independent developers and stuff like this. But it wasn't really an industry I spent a lot of time researching, and I think that was probably where I went wrong, really. It was something that I jumped into because I thought, well, I'd love to use this product, so surely everyone else will. So we created this platform, and it was, it just didn't take off. It didn't gain the momentum that I was hoping for, and obviously spent probably about a year creating it, and obviously all the costs that go with that, hiring web developers to build it, and then spending time and money on the marketing. And we grew it to a certain size. We had customers, we had some momentum, but it just was kind of plateaued. It capture the industry. It didn't really sort of create a dent that I wanted to. So I got an offer a couple of years later, and I just said, yeah, it's probably time to call it a day.
Mm-hmm. And with respect to like starting up several businesses, like at what point would you say it would be time to call it quits? Because I feel like there would be several factors and it's different for everyone, but is there some kind of general idea? I mean, like, because there's the thing, you want to work on it, you want to give it enough time and effort, but at the same time you have to take a step back, and when it comes to a point like, okay, do I continue to persevere, or is it time to focus on the next thing?
I kind of think like 2 years is enough time. I think if you spent 2 years on, obviously there's a whole thing, the phrase of fail fast, right? You can't launch a business and always expect it to take off ridiculously and become hugely successful within like the space of 6 months. It doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you've got to spend 6 months just creating enough momentum and getting traffic to a website before it starts really getting anywhere on Google, like with organic rankings. So I think after a 2-year period, if something's really, still not kind of breaking even, or at a point where you think, that this hasn't got legs, I think that's probably a good time to call it quits. But then again, there's so many different factors. There's a lot of my businesses have been built. Well, the first few businesses that were entirely bootstrapped. So, for us, it was very much important that we turn a profit because we had bills to pay. We had our staff wages and office space and all this kind of stuff. Whereas if you're a company that's backed by VC, sometimes VC-backed companies don't make a profit or don't make any money for years, and they'll just raise more and more and more investment. And sometimes they can grow crazy big, look at Uber, for example, and still not make any money. But then would you say Uber's a failure? No, of course not. It's a huge success, but it's just one of these things where it's just kind of, they've had so much an insane amount of money pumped into it over the years. And it's become this big global organization. So I think it depends on the business and the sort of the situation, and also I suppose the founder's attitude as well. Like again, I've seen people who have kind of run businesses for years and years, and sometimes it won't make a huge profit, but if it's paying the bills, and they're happy, then you could consider it a success. So keep going. It just depends on what you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. So before we touch base on matchmaker.fm, I'm really curious to know what your tips are on running multiple companies simultaneously.
Yeah.
I feel like
that's a good question.
You're constantly juggling.
So I think like right now I've got 3 different websites, I suppose, under 2 different companies, so 2 different sort of corporations. Make sure you've got a good team around you. Don't sort of it's good. So the way we operate is we have separate development teams who are working on each product. I think that's really important. With marketing, there is a little bit of crossover. So we have some people who are working across different brands, but as much as we can, we'll try and dedicate resource to each individual brand. Obviously, my job as a founder is to kind of keep the ship driving forward, so to speak. So and again, I think sometimes you've only got so much mental bandwidth, so it's kind of a case of you have to sometimes focus on one thing and then like come back to one. So for example, Radio.co now is 6 years old. We've got a great team behind the product. It's a mature sort of business now, so it doesn't require as much of my time. However, you still can't take your eye off the ball too much. You've still got to kind of pay attention to where it's going. Whereas Matchmaker at the moment is very, very high growth. I'm sure we'll get onto this in a second. So with Matchmaker, that's kind of occupying a lot of my kind of mental bandwidth on a day-to-day basis, I guess. But it's just about balance, really. But I think, there are some people who've got, I think 3 right now is probably enough for me. I don't think I'd want to have any more right this second. But there are sometimes people who, sometimes in some cases might have like 10, 20 different businesses. It's just about making sure you've got the right structure in place so you're not trying to do everything all yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. And with respect to Matchmaker, it started off as a side project, and just over a year ago, like when you launched it, and now you've reached the milestone of a community of 25K. And it just blows my mind because I'm trying to think in my head, like, how did I find out about it? Maybe it was like on LinkedIn or Twitter. And then when I came across it, I was just so amazed. I'm like, oh my gosh, like finally a platform, because prior to finding Matchmaker, I was just going through my LinkedIn network, or like LinkedIn connections, just like scouring, like, okay, who can be a good podcast? Like, do they even want to be on my podcast? So yeah, could you talk about how the Matchmaker came to be?
Yeah, so Matchmaker was one of these products that was a real sort of pleasant accident almost. We were, so probably, just coming up to 2 years ago, the summer before last, we were launching podcast.co. We were looking at different ways to market and sort of different funnels that we could create to drive traffic to our website. And obviously we thought, well, loads of podcasts are based on having guests or finding people for interviews. So we kind of set up these landing pages which said, if you're looking for great guests, we can match you up with them. And it was really like a very basic MVP. And we sort of came across this. We thought, well, let's just see if there's something here. So we started running some traffic to it. We had one page which was targeted towards podcasters looking for guests, and one page which was targeted towards guests looking to be featured on podcasts. And these weren't just like put your name and your email in. They were like, please give us your the details about your podcast. Tell us what your podcast's about. What sort of guests are you looking for? And sort of vice versa. And we noticed that people were actually filling these out, and it was effectively like people creating a profile about themselves. But we didn't actually have any way of kind of connecting these two groups of people together. So we thought maybe this has got legs. Maybe there's an opportunity here. So we sat down with our designer. We were in the midst of launching podcast.co, so we didn't spend a lot of time on it then. But what we did is we kind of came up with this idea of Matchmaker, and we kind of thought, well, it's a bit like Tinder but for podcasters, really like a tongue-in-cheek sort of expression. But but let's design this product and maybe we'll come back to it. So probably 6 months went past. We launched podcast.co, and then we thought, okay, maybe let's give this a go. Let's create sort of a platform. We've already got these lists of people. I think by that stage we maybe had 200 or 300 entries into these forms. So they were, if you like, our beta users. But so we already had the kind of the data there. So we, rather than just being like an empty platform, we had a group of people who we could say, look, come and join us and see how it gets on. And we learned really quickly that the feedback we had was tremendous. When we put the product live, it was February 2020, just to those users and our existing customers, and then we kind of launched it to the public in kind of March, April time, and really started pushing it. And yeah, we've just hit. We're at about 27,500 users now, in just over a year, and it's really exciting. And it's one of these products it's a delight as an entrepreneur, because I constantly have people thanking me for the platform, which is really unusual, because like normally you create a product and you're trying to sell it, and it's almost like you've got to try and overcome those barriers, that friction, because you're trying to get money off people for a product or a service, and there's always lots of ifs and buts and whys, and you've got to try and figure out really what the route to market is going to be. Whereas with Matchmaker, it seems to have been pretty much plain sailing. We have a lot of people who join us. We've got some really exciting users, and we constantly hear from users who are just getting great results on a day-to-day basis, which is like really rewarding as an entrepreneur. We're at a stage now where we've kind of realized that this is an interesting platform. It's more than just a side project, so we're kind of starting to look to potentially raise investment to sort of take things to the next level, which is pretty exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's such a fantastic idea. I can't tell you how excited every time I check my inbox, and then I gotta get these messages saying like, "Oh, we'd love for you to be a guest on your podcast."
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, me? Really? Wow, that's so exciting! It's such an honor. And then like likewise, yeah, being able to find guests, like the right kind of guests that I want for my podcast. And every time someone asks like, where can I find podcast guests, I refer to Matchmaker. I'm like, just go to Matchmaker. Which brings me to my next question. Maybe you already have it in place, but is there a referral program?
There's not yet. It's something we've talked about, and I think it's something we'll probably like implement at some stage. Yeah, I mean, the main thing with Matchmaker, the main challenge over the past year has just been building it to that kind of critical mass where you've got enough users. Like no one wants to sign up to something if it's just got like a couple of hundred people on it. It doesn't work. So we're obviously, because it's been free and we've not really been monetizing it until recently. Creating a kind of like an affiliate program or a referral program has not really made sense, but we're looking at how we can potentially do that and I certainly think it's something that we'll probably implement at some stage. Most recently, actually today, finally we just managed to get our iOS app out the door. I don't know if you noticed.
Yeah.
So we had Android, which the Android app came out like about a month and a half ago, and Apple's notoriously difficult review process has just held us back, which is really frustrating. But finally we got it live yesterday, and we were like, yes. So hopefully that's going to, again, because again, one of the things you have with a kind of community platform such as this is, you want to keep people engaged. And of course, the current method of you get an email to your inbox when you get a new message isn't ideal. Whereas if you get a ping on your phone, it's going to be much easier. So hopefully we're going to increase engagement, and it's just going to be a better experience for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think having that messenger app is such a great idea. And yeah, thank you so much for putting it on Android, because I feel most of the apps that I want, especially Clubhouse, they're on iOS, and they'll never get on Android. Yeah, so
right, okay.
It's like, all right, you know what? I'm just gonna miss out, and I'll just do other things instead.
I find it astonishing with Clubhouse, just because, like, number one, they've had huge growth. Number two, I'm sure they've not, they're not short of investment. They've had a lot of money put into it. Why haven't we got an Android app? Surely, like, if we're a tiny little startup, surely Clubhouse could afford to put together an Android app. I don't get what gives there. That's strange, isn't it? But
yeah, it is. It is very strange. And just kind of adding a little bit more to the Messenger app, I think it's also a great idea, just because with respect to scheduling podcasts, you kind of want to get that ball rolling and the conversation like going as soon as possible. Like with respect to requests, I try to answer as soon as possible and like give a link to my schedule, because it's something that you want to kind of have in place, because especially when you're doing interviews, you have to prepare for them. So you need to just allot some time to prepare. Well, I'm assuming that most people prepare for their their podcast when they have to interview guests. And I also wanted to talk about the 30 podcasts in 30 days tour. When I came across that, I was just like, oh my God, like that must have been so intense, even though it was a virtual tour. So could you speak to that, and what made you decide to attempt that intense challenge?
Well, okay, so a couple of reasons. Like, number one, I was aware that I was founder of this platform to introduce guests and podcasters, and I'd done a few shows and interviews myself, but I hadn't done loads, so I was like, I probably should do like a few more. Number two, it was a great way of getting the word out about Matchmaker, because a lot of people listening to podcasts either had their own podcasts or they'd be interested in doing guests. So it was a good way of doing that. It was a great way of engaging with and talking to users of the platform, so I could get feedback. And fourthly, one of the weird reasons is just like I was in lockdown, and I was at home. I wasn't we normally are office based. Obviously, we've been working from home for the past year. I'm still working from home now. And I was like, I've got this time on my hands where I can easily just hop in and out of calls, which I would never have the opportunity or time to do when I'm at the office, because there's too many distractions, or other people are using the meeting room, or I've got other stuff going on. So I was like, this is a great time just to actually kind of get stuck in, and I could kind of be flexible. I could hop in and out. If I wanted to do one in the evening, I could, and likewise during the day. So I just thought it'd be a really exciting thing, and I ended up doing 48 actually within 30 days, and I didn't. The 30. So to give myself a break, I didn't do like 30 days as in 1 month. It was more like in the end 6 weeks. So I just counted like Monday to Friday. So I wasn't doing recordings at the weekend. So it made it a little bit more manageable. But yeah, it was really good fun, and I just met so many interesting people in the process. And I still try and do maybe like 4 or 5 podcasts a month. I mean, there's some months where I don't do any, and there's some months where I'll probably do a few more, but I try and kind of keep it fairly consistent. And my opinion of it is just, it's such a fantastic way to meet interesting people and have really cool conversations.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And, having done that many podcasts, even though it wasn't 30 days straight, like, how did you maintain the energy and the stamina? Like, I'm not sure about you, but whenever I'm a guest on podcasts, and even when I'm interviewing people, it's kind of like I'm really focused. I focus all my energy in that one particular hour, but then afterwards I'm like, okay, I need a break. And I actually, spend a few days like not talking to people.
Yeah. I think, so some tips are, the way I approached it was I kind of categorized the 3 different types of podcasts that I wanted to approach. So some were like mainly focused on like marketing. Some were focused on sort of the entrepreneurial stuff, and then some were focused more on like sort of personal development or sort of self-improvement, that kind of thing. And then for each of these 3 categories of podcasts, I had like a few different topics that I wanted to talk about. So you could kind of like, the best thing to do as a guest is just try and like figure out what your skill set or what your knowledge applies to, and try and like just don't think, okay, let's say you're a nutritionist. Don't just think, okay, I need to be on nutrition podcasts, but you could be on podcasts which are health and fitness. You can be on podcasts which are about entrepreneurial mindset or all sorts of stuff. So try and think about like outside the box. What skills, what areas could you kind of go into and kind of give your wisdom. In terms of like remaining upbeat, yeah, I know what you mean. It's sometimes, especially like back then, I was doing sometimes 3 or 4 podcasts in a single day, and then sometimes they'd be, because of the time zone differences. Obviously, I'm in the UK. I'd be sometimes recording at 7 p.m. at night, and it can be tough. If you need to reschedule because you're completely like, tired and just think you're not going to be great, that's always an option. Have a coffee beforehand probably helps. Like, and I think just generally, like, yeah, you've got to just try and give it 110%. I think the advice I give to people when they're either starting a podcast or starting to kind of guest gig on podcasts is, if you think about it as, you try and give 110% of your normal self. So you've got to just like ramp up your normal personality just by like 10% extra, because it comes across on camera, it comes across when you're listening down the microphone or via your headphones or whatever, versus just kind of just trying to be completely like chilled. I think you need to try and like just have a little bit more excitement than perhaps you normally would.
Yeah, it's
smile.
So true. Yeah, it's funny because when I tell people I'm actually quite socially awkward and introverted, they find it very surprising, just because they're like, oh, well, you sound very like energetic and enthusiastic. I'm like, well, yeah, of course, like you're talking about, you have to bump it up a little bit or people won't want to listen to your podcast. So yeah, that's really great advice. And although people are getting vaccinated, like, the idea of a virtual tour, like, because it's more economical and flexible, it sounds more appealing. Like, do you think this is something that people would consider to do in the future, even though things are like opening up, or just because it enables you to like talk to people? You don't have to worry so much about, like, say a tour bus or a tour manager.
Well, yeah, or just, I mean, again, I do think, I used to record podcasts face to face, and I think you do have a different dynamic when you sat in person with someone. However, the tools online, we at the moment we're using Riverside FM. There's a bunch of these tools like Squadcast and Welder, which do all the same sort of thing. And it is sort of the next best thing. I think it's weird because when we built Matchmaker, like the location thing and having this sort of in-person, available for in-person interviews, remote interviews, because obviously we designed it like a year or two before the pandemic hit. It seemed like it was quite an important feature, whereas now I kind of feel like it's not as much. I think actually it's about what people have got to offer, the stories they want to tell. That's kind of what people want to know more about. I think it's become not more irrelevant having people face to face. But as I say, I think face to face does have an extra dynamic. Whether or not it will go back to like, I think even like when you look at I don't know, if you look at movie stars being interviewed on chat shows. It would always be a case they'd be sat there on the couch, whereas now a lot of the time they have them on a screen. I don't know if that will ever go back to that, that old school way of doing things, or I think moving forward is probably going to be more of a combination. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? I mean, I like the idea of convenience. So the majority, I would say like 99.9% of my podcast, I think there was only one time, and that was when I was just dabbling in podcasting, a little side note. I tried to launch in 2015, didn't work, so I launched in 2019. Right. But I'm a big fan of the remote podcasting, just again because of the flexibility and location. And like you said, you're in the UK, I'm based in Canada, and of course, unfortunately I don't have the funds to fly you over if I wanted to. And I think it's great because with Matchmaker, I've been getting requests from people who are not only based in Canada, but also in the States, in the UK, and other parts of Europe, and it just sounds I don't know. It just also it makes me feel like I can promote my podcast to like another level, saying like, oh, well, I have international guests like from Europe and
That's
Australia.
True. And do you know what I think as well? I think, Karen, like when things kind of go back to normal and like normal sort of business travel resumes, like if you're going, say, like I was supposed to go to South by Southwest in Austin, Texas last year, just literally, and it was cancelled right at the last minute. And I've been once before, back in 2017. Now, since then, I've interviewed or been interviewed by like probably 4 or 5 people who live in Austin, which is where South by Southwest is held. So I guarantee you, next time I'm in Austin, if I go to South by again, I will probably meet up. I'll make an effort to reach out to the people I've spoken to on my podcast, or I've spoken to on their podcast, and actually say, look, hey, I'm at South by. Do you want to go out for a beer, or do you want to go for a drink or whatever? So it's a great networking tool, and I do think that you can sort of in a weird way like almost make friends or build your network, all around the world. And I think certainly, you'd make when you met. I expect to sort of feel like I almost know those people, even though I've never met them before, because I've recorded an episode with them.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you 100%. With podcasting being a networking tool, because I started with a blog, and then I connected with bloggers, and now that I have a podcast, I'm connecting with a completely different set of people, which I think is really cool. And then just again, also agreeing with you how you feel like you know the person, just because again with the podcast interview, I feel with podcasting it's such like an intimate medium, just like talking to them and like listening to their voice, listening to the way their voice sounds like when they get really excited about something, and then when they're like, I guess, not so excited about something. So yeah, definitely agree with that. So I just want to continue the conversation a little bit with like some other podcasting trends since the start of the pandemic. I don't know about you, if you can speak to this the same way. I feel like the podcasting space has like exploded. Like I feel almost everybody, your friend, your brother, your mother, your sister is starting a podcast. So do you feel like it's reaching a saturation point?
No, I don't. I think there was a lot of people who start. Interestingly, some data I saw the other day, which was on the Pod News newsletter, and they said, basically they did an analysis of like, there's about 2 million podcasts now on Apple. Okay, sort of 2 million podcasts out there in the wild. And that figure was only about 1 million about this time last year. I think they had just hit 1 million. So obviously since then, like, and before that, it was like 800,000. So yeah, like there's probably been over 1 million podcasts started over the past year. But if you look at the amount of those podcasts, I think they analysed it and they were like, the amount of shows that had got more than like 10 episodes was only like 800,000. And there's a huge chunk of that which is only like 1 episode or 2 episodes. So yeah, there's lots of people who have said, I've started a podcast, but one of the main sort of important traits of a good podcaster is being consistent. It's making sure you're pushing content out on a regular basis according to a good schedule, so you can kind of build up that consistency for your listeners. And I think, obviously recording 1 episode and thinking, I'm going to get like 1 million people tuning in is just unrealistic. But people do think that, for some reason. This is just the same as if you're starting a YouTube channel or an Instagram account. You've got to post consistently, you've got to upload consistently, whatever. But yeah, so I think 800,000 is the number of like podcasts that are active. And I think they did some more analysis. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head of how many of those 800,000 had actually published an episode, say, over the past few weeks or a month or whatever. So the number's even lower. So I still think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. If you compare that to the number of active Facebook pages or YouTube channels or whatever, it's a very low number. It's just about trying to find your niche, making sure that you're consistent, making sure that you're producing content that's interesting and captivating. But it's a really exciting medium, so I don't think it's sort of reached saturation. No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Just talking about how like a lot of people starting them, but not that many pushing past the 10 episode mark. And do you think it's because they have a hard time like with the consistency? Like, what do you think are some factors that makes people like quit so soon after?
Well, I think it's probably an easy to answer, like how to approach it. I think if you're starting a podcast, don't just think about what you're going to talk about in episode number 1, but try and map out like the first season. So if you're going to do, say, 8 episodes or 10 episodes, whatever, and then come back and maybe have a little break and then come back to season number 2. That's always how I recommend doing it, rather than saying just committing to doing 52 episodes a year, because it can be quite grueling at times. But yeah, I think my advice is always like, try and map that season out and think, right, what story are we going to tell and how these episodes going to link together. So if you're creating about a podcast about marketing, and again, this is what Matchmaker's great for, because you can then find experts to talk about whatever you want. So if you're going to do a podcast about marketing, you might say in episode number 1, talk about content. You might talk about Facebook ads in episode 2, SEO in episode number 3, media buying or whatever in episode 4. So you can then go and find experts who can talk about each of those topics and sort of plan it out, so you've got sort of like a coherent series that makes sense. Versus just thinking, let's just chat about marketing for one episode and just kind of making it up as you go along. I think if you can have an idea of the sort of the content you want to deliver to your audience, that really helps.
And as you were talking about that, I thought about the post you have featured on your LinkedIn profile. And it makes me laugh. I'm going to laugh as I start to say it, how to make a shit podcast.
Yeah.
I'm like, and I'll put the link in the show notes in the summary for
it's a funny
the audience, because it is just truly, truly funny. So, of course, we know what makes a shitty podcast, but I want to ask you, what's the difference between a good podcast versus a great podcast?
Oh, that's a really good question. Again, I think that's really subjective, isn't it? It depends what you listen to podcasts for. There's obviously a lot of people who go to them for entertainment. Personally, I don't. I tend to listen more for facts. I tend to listen because I'm interested to learn more about stuff that's going on online or in industry, or trying to learn some new ninja marketing tricks or whatever, versus like listening to a horror series or whatever. So I guess what makes a good podcast is just. I always think when you have a teaser at the beginning of the episode that kind of gives you an inkling as to what you're going to learn in that episode, that's always good, because it kind of says, this is why you should invest your time in tuning into this entire episode. And quite often the intro of a podcast, it can be, they can kind of be quite sort of similar in terms of, like, we started this episode with a little bit about my background, etc. So I always think, if you can sort of sell that episode at the beginning of the sort of episode, it's always a good idea. Just come up with, like, if you're a podcaster, just do like a little pre-record, say, here are the 3 things that we're going to learn during this episode, and it gives the the listener a reason to keep tuning in. And as I mentioned before, consistency, having a clear description of the title. Again, just saying that you're talking to, your podcast is great about this, because you don't just say who you're talking to, but you talk about what you're going to learn in that episode. I think that's really key to it as well.
So I want to change it up a bit. So one of my closing questions, and this is actually taken from an article from the education section of matchmaker.com. I just discovered Amplify.
Yeah.
If you could have dinner with any 3 podcasters, who would they be and why?
Okay, so I think Joe Rogan, just because he's insane, isn't he? And he's managed to grow this crazy. I think he'd be interesting. Although I can't imagine going for dinner with him. It would just end up being a podcast episode. There's a UK kind of motivational guy who was like a sort of hypnotist called Paul McKenna. I quite like. I've always been a big fan of his. I've read a lot of his books, certainly when I was kind of young and kind of starting my career. Who else? Tim Ferriss is another good one. 24-hour work week. I remember reading that back in the day. It was pretty inspirational for me at the time. So yeah, there we go.
Cool. I can also imagine all 4 of you just chatting in a pub too, when it's safe to do so.
The pubs have opened up out now in England, but you can only sit outside. So it's another month before we can actually go and sit inside. Which is fine, apart from that the weather's not been great over the past couple of weeks. So literally on the first day everything opened up, everyone was sat there with big thick coats on, shivering away trying to eat their food. But yeah, when it's safe to do so, totally.
Mm-hmm. And looking back on your entrepreneurial journey, was there anything that surprised you along the way?
I think the biggest surprise was when I managed to strike a deal when I was about 22 years old with AOL. And I couldn't quite believe it, really. It was one of those turning points in my career. probably a story for another time. But I literally changed my fortunes, I suppose. And I was just this 22-year-old kid. I flew to New York just to go meet them because they kind of expressed interest in working with us, and I was like, I've just got to get on a plane and see them. And they didn't ask me to, but I knew it was a good idea. And I left that meeting and I was like, wow. That was like one of those moments where I was just like, couldn't quite believe what was happening, and it was pretty incredible.
Wow, that sounds absolutely amazing. And I know you're online pretty much everywhere, but I guess my question to you is like, if people wanted to connect with you, where would you be the most active online?
Probably, well, I LinkedIn, I'm quite active, and YouTube, I try and upload one video a week. There depends. Sometimes they're focusing on podcasting type stuff. Sometimes it's radio. Sometimes it's equipment. But all of my social links are on jamesm.com/connect. You can find all my sort of social media channels there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this really great conversation. I really enjoyed learning about your journey and just chatting about podcasting.
Likewise, Karen. Thanks very much for having me on.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and stay tuned for more episodes. Ciao for now. Bye.